On July 8, 1853, 4 American warships appeared off Uraga, Japan, 2 of them steam-powered, belching black smoke. Commodore Matthew Perry carried a letter from the US President requesting open ports. He was not asking. The cannons were the punctuation. Japan had been closed for 250 years. The Tokugawa policy of Sakoku, chained country, made it illegal for any Japanese citizen to leave on pain of death. Historians working in the Edo period archives have found diaries of samurai officials showing the shogunate knew, by the early 19th century, it was living on borrowed time. Dutch intelligence from Nagasaki described the steam engine, the Industrial Revolution, the military consequences of modern weapons. They knew. They couldn't figure out what to do. Samurai trained 250 years in sword fighting were now looking at cannon that could sink their ships before a blade could be drawn. So, who were the Tokugawa? And why did the most coherent political system Japan ever produced collapse in 15 years? The Japan of the century before Tokugawa Ieyasu unified. It was a landscape of war so continuous and so pervasive that Japanese historians gave it a name, Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, a period roughly spanning 1467 to 1615, in which central political authority had collapsed, and the country had fragmented into dozens of competing domains, each controlled by a military lord called a daimyo, each fighting the others for territory, resources, and the theoretical prize of national supremacy. The Sengoku period was not simply political fragmentation. It was a transformation of Japanese society at every level, driven by the dynamics of a military competition that lasted for generations. The old aristocratic order, in which birth determined status and warriors fought according to the conventions of ritual combat inherited from earlier centuries, dissolved under the pressure of warfare that rewarded effectiveness over lineage. The ashigaru, foot soldiers drawn from the peasant class, armed with spears and eventually with firearms, became the primary military force of the period, replacing the horseback archery of the samurai aristocracy with the disciplined massed infantry tactics that were also transforming warfare in Europe at exactly the same time. A daimyo who could not organize effective ashigaru formations, who relied solely on the mounted samurai of the old tradition, lost. The introduction of firearms was the technological event that most dramatically changed the military equation of the Sengoku period. Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543, carrying matchlock arquebuses, the most advanced infantry firearms of the 16th century. Japanese craftsmen, encountering these weapons for the first time, reverse-engineered them within months and began manufacturing Japanese versions in quantities that eventually made Japan one of the countries with the largest number of firearms per capita in the world. The irony that the country which would later ban firearms as part of its deliberate isolation policy had become, during the Sengoku period, the world's largest manufacturer of matchlock rifles, is one of the more striking facts in the history of technology policy. 3 figures dominate the narrative of Japanese reunification. Oda Nobunaga, who began the military conquest that brought most of central Japan under a single authority before being assassinated by one of his own generals in 1582. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who completed the military unification, and then launched 2 disastrous invasions of Korea that drained Japanese military resources and prestige, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had been Nobunaga's ally and Hideyoshi's subordinate and who outlived them both, waiting with a patience that contemporaries found either admirable or unsettling. For the moment, when Hideyoshi's death and the vulnerability of his young heir would create the opportunity to take everything. The social cost of the Sengoku period was enormous and not fully recoverable in the generation that followed its end. Millions of people had been displaced, villages burned, agricultural infrastructure destroyed, and the accumulated wealth of centuries dissipated in military campaigns that produced nothing except the survival of the winning faction. The population of Japan in 1600, at the moment when the Tokugawa victory was becoming clear, was a country exhausted by war, ready, as exhausted countries always are, to accept almost any arrangement that promised a durable peace. Tokugawa Ieyasu understood this, and he built his system to take advantage of it. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543, the same year Portuguese firearms arrived in Japan, and his life, until his final victory at the age of 57, was one of the longest sustained exercises in strategic patience in the history of political ambition. He spent his early childhood as a hostage, held first by the Oda clan and then by the Imagawa clan as a guarantee of his father's loyalty, a common practice in the political culture of the Sengoku period that was as brutal in its psychological implications as it sounds. A child separated from his parents, raised in the household of people whose relationship to him was primarily as a political asset, learns specific lessons about the nature of trust and the uses of patience that children of the powerful and the protected do not. He allied with Oda Nobunaga after the Imagawa's power collapsed, served as Nobunaga's subordinate, and then ally for 2 decades, survived Nobunaga's assassination, navigated the complex politics of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's ascendancy as a loyal subordinate who never gave Hideyoshi sufficient cause to move against him, and waited. The specific quality of his waiting was not passivity. He was building his power base systematically throughout this period, consolidating his control of the Kanto region. The broad agricultural plain of eastern Honshu centered on the bay where he would eventually build his capital, developing administrative systems, cultivating relationships with daimyo, who would eventually be his allies, and biding his time with what every contemporary account describes as a superhuman ability to suppress his ambitions until the moment was right. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving a 5-year-old son as his heir and a council of regents, of which Ieyasu was the most powerful member, to govern in his name, the moment arrived. Ieyasu moved quickly enough to secure his position before opposition could organize, slowly enough to maintain the appearance of loyalty to the Toyotomi cause until the military alignment he needed was in place. The Battle of Sekigahara in October 1600, a major engagement in central Japan that took a single day but settled the question of who would rule, ended with the defeat of the Western coalition that had organized against Ieyasu and with his effective control of Japan. He did not immediately claim the shogunate. He waited 3 years, consolidating his military and political position before accepting appointment as shogun from the imperial court in Kyoto in 1603. Then, 2 years later, he resigned the shogunate in favor of his son Hidetada, a political act whose specific purpose was to establish clearly that the shogunate was a Tokugawa inheritance, not a personal appointment, and that the Toyotomi claim to rival authority was without basis. The message was unambiguous. Tokugawa shoguns would succeed Tokugawa shoguns. The line was fixed. The question of succession, the question that had generated a century of warfare, was answered by design rather than left to be resolved by force. The final elimination of the Toyotomi as a political threat came with the sieges of Osaka Castle in 1614 and 1615, in which Ieyasu's forces attacked and destroyed the castle that had been Hideyoshi's power center and killed Hideyoshi's son, Toyotomi Hideyori. The official justification for the attack, that an inscription on a bell commissioned for a temple associated with the castle contained language that could be interpreted as a curse on the Tokugawa, was transparently pretextual. Ieyasu was 73 years old, dying of disease. Add to basket and he understood that leaving a potentially legitimate rival claimant alive was a structural threat to the system he had spent his life building. He eliminated it. He died the following year, having completed what he had set out to do. The geography of the Japanese archipelago shaped the Tokugawa system in ways that were both enabling and ultimately limiting. 4 main islands, Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido, arranged in a long arc along the western Pacific Rim, separated from the Asian mainland by the Korea Strait and the Sea of Japan, provided a natural isolation that the Tokugawa policy of Sakoku formalized into deliberate political strategy. The sea was both a defensive barrier and a limiting horizon. It kept out the threats that had periodically destabilized the mainland Asian powers. The Mongol invasions that had failed to conquer Japan in 1274 and 1281 due to typhoons were a foundational episode in Japanese national mythology. But it also defined the absolute limit of the territorial domain that could be governed from Edo, the mountainous terrain of the main islands. Japan is approximately 75% mountainous, with the flat, cultivable land concentrated in river, valleys, and coastal plains, created a dispersed settlement pattern and made overland communication, military movement relatively slow and difficult. The Tokaido Road, the primary highway connecting Edo in the east to Kyoto in the west, the two political centers of the Tokugawa system, was one of the great engineering achievements of the early Edo period, a maintained way station road of approximately 500 kilometers that could carry rapid communication between the two capitals and facilitate the movement of armies when necessary. But the mountainous interior between the main road corridors remained difficult terrain that local daimyo could exploit to maintain a degree of physical independence from central authority. The rice agriculture of the alluvial plains was the economic foundation of the entire system. Rice in Tokugawa Japan was not merely a food. It was the primary unit of economic value, the medium in which tax revenues were assessed and paid, the measure of a domain's wealth expressed in terms of koku. The amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year, approximately 278 liters, and the basis of the social hierarchy that organized everything from military rank to the right to carry swords. A daimyo with a domain rated at 100 zeros or koku was a great lord. A samurai whose stipend was expressed as 100 koku was a middle-ranking warrior. A domain's koku rating determined its military obligations, its administrative status, and its position in the complex web of relationships that connected every element of the Tokugawa political system to every other. The city of Edo, built on the swampy low ground around the bay at the eastern end of the Kanto Plain, on a site that had been a minor castle town before Ieyasu designated it his capital, grew with extraordinary speed into one of the largest cities in the world. By the early 18th century, Edo had a population of approximately 1 million people, making it comparable in size to London or Beijing, and larger than any other city in Japan by an enormous margin. The engineering required to transform a tidal wetland into a functional metropolis of this scale was considerable. Extensive land reclamation from the bay, the construction of a canal and moat system that served both defensive and commercial purposes, the management of freshwater supplies and waste disposal for a population density that was, in the most crowded quarters, among the highest in the world. The Edo that resulted, noisy, dense, commercially vital, organized around the castle complex that was the shogunate's administrative heart, was the product of deliberate design as much as organic growth. The administrative system that the Tokugawa Shogunate developed to govern Japan was, in its specific design and its practical effectiveness, one of the most sophisticated political constructions of the pre-modern world. It solved, for 2.5 centuries, The fundamental problem of Japanese political history. How to maintain central authority over a country organized around semi-autonomous regional lords who had the military capacity to challenge that authority if their individual interests diverged sufficiently from the center's requirements. The solution was the Sankin Kotai system, the alternate attendance requirement that obligated every daimyo to spend alternate years at his own domain and at Edo, maintaining a permanent household in the capital where his family remained as de facto hostages, even when he was absent. The system was administratively brilliant in its specific design. The cost of maintaining two complete households, one in the domain, one in Edo, staffed at the appropriate level of magnificence for the daimyo's rank, and of traveling between them in the processions that protocol required was enormous, consuming a substantial fraction of each domain's rice revenue. A daimyo who was spending his money on alternate year residence in Edo and procession costs was a daimyo who had less money available to build fortifications, hire additional soldiers, or otherwise accumulate the material means of challenging shogunal authority. The Sankin Kotai system was, among other things, a mechanism for systematically draining the financial resources of the domains that might otherwise have funded rebellion. The agricultural administration of the period produced a sustained increase in rice production that underpinned the economic growth of the early and Middle Edo period. New agricultural techniques, improved seed varieties, expanded use of fertilizers, better water management for paddy rice cultivation, spread through the agricultural population through a combination of official promotion and the informal transmission of successful practice between farming communities. The area under cultivation expanded as land was reclaimed and new territories were brought into productive use. The population of Japan grew from approximately 12 million in 1600 to perhaps 30 million by 1720 CE, fed by an agricultural system whose productivity was increasing faster than the population it sustained. The commercial economy that developed in the shadow of the rice-based official system was one of the most dynamic features of the Edo period, and one that the shogunate's ideological framework, organized around Confucian values that placed merchants at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below warriors, farmers, and artisans, had not anticipated and could not effectively control. The merchants of the great commercial cities, Osaka, Kyoto, Edo, grew wealthy from the trade in rice, cotton, sake, and manufactured goods that the movement of goods between the capital, the domains, and the trading ports generated. By the 18th century, the wealthiest merchant houses, the Mitsui, the Sumitomo, the Konoiki, had accumulated financial resources that exceeded those of many daimyo, and their banking and credit operations were essential to the functioning of the fiscal system that officially dismissed them as socially inferior. The irony was visible to contemporaries and became a source of cultural tension that expressed itself in the popular literature, theatre, and visual arts of the period. The samurai of the Tokugawa period were, by the standards of the Sengoku period that had preceded them, warriors without a war. The Pax Tokugawa, the 2.5 centuries of internal peace that the shogunate maintained, was the most remarkable feature of the system. But it created a specific problem for the class, whose social identity was organized around military service. What does a warrior do when there is nothing to fight? The answer that Tokugawa Japan developed was, in retrospect, extraordinarily consequential. The samurai became administrators. They staffed the bureaucracies of the shogunate and the domain governments. They managed the financial accounts, conducted the judicial proceedings, maintained the records, and performed all the functions of a governmental apparatus that required literate, educated, disciplined personnel. The sword, the katana that was the legal marker of samurai status, which commoners were forbidden to carry, became primarily a social symbol rather than a practical weapon, representing the samurai's role in the social order rather than his current military function. The specific two-sword combination that came to identify the samurai, the long katana paired with a shorter wakizashi, was more visible as a status marker in the streets of Edo than it was functional as a combat system in a country at peace. The Bushido, the way of the warrior, the ethical code governing samurai conduct, was, in its fully articulated form, actually a product of the Edo period rather than the period of active warfare that preceded it. When samurai were actually fighting, they were too busy staying alive to write philosophical treatises about how they should behave. It was when the fighting stopped that the philosophical articulation began. The most influential text of the Bushido tradition, the Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century from the oral teachings of a retired saga domain samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo, contains the famous statement that the way of the samurai is found in death, a formulation whose radical nature reflected the specific anxiety of a warrior class that was no longer being asked to die for anything practical. The Hagakure was not a warrior's field manual. It was a meditation on identity composed by a man who had never fought in battle and was trying to understand what being a samurai meant in a world that no longer needed samurai to fight. The one significant internal military event of the Edo period, the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, was both a demonstration of the shogunate's military capacity and a catalyst for the policies that defined the remaining 2 centuries of its existence. The rebellion was a peasant uprising in the Shimabara Peninsula of Kyushu, driven by a combination of economic oppression and the specific circumstances of a heavily Christian population resisting the shogunate's suppression of Christianity. Approximately 37,000 rebels, predominantly peasants and ronin, samurai without masters, along with women and children, fortified themselves in a ruined castle at Hara and held off a shogunal army of over 100 Zeus and men for months before the castle fell, and virtually the entire defending population was massacred. The rebellion persuaded the shogunate that Christianity, which the rebels had made central to their resistance, was an existential threat to social order and accelerated the implementation of the total exclusion of Christians and the near-total exclusion of foreigners that would define the Sakoku policy for the next 2 centuries. The Tokugawa shoguns governed Japan through a system of control whose specific mechanisms were more sophisticated than simple violence, though violence was always available and occasionally deployed. The genius of the Tokugawa system was that it made compliance the rational choice for almost everyone, almost all of the time. Through a combination of material incentives, social controls, and institutional arrangements that aligned individual interests with systemic stability. The laws governing social behavior in Tokugawa Japan were extraordinarily detailed, specifying not just the major categories of legal obligation and prohibition, but the minute particulars of how people of different social classes were expected to dress, eat, travel, conduct their financial affairs, and relate to their social superiors. The sumptuary laws that regulated merchant dress and entertainment were a specific expression of the ideological project of keeping the merchant class in its officially inferior social position, despite its increasing economic power. A merchant who was visibly wealthier than the samurai official of above him in the social hierarchy was a source of conceptual disorder that the Tokugawa system attempted to manage through legal prohibition of the visible signs of wealth. The prohibitions were widely evaded. The wealthy merchant culture of Edo and Osaka developed ingenious strategies for consuming luxury goods whose outward appearance was modest enough to comply with the letter of the sumptuary laws while violating their spirit completely. But the legal framework remained in place, a continuing statement of the social values the system was organized to maintain. The treatment of those who violated the fundamental rules of the Tokugawa order was calibrated to deter, rather than merely to punish. Public executions were staged and documented events. Their procedure precisely specified this, their audience expected to include sufficient witnesses to ensure that the penalty's deterrent message reached the intended audience. The specific form of execution varied with the social status of the condemned and the nature of the offense. Beheading for samurai, crucifixion, or burning for commoners in the most serious cases, in a way that maintained even in death the social distinctions that organized life. The seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, that was the prescribed form of honorable death for samurai who had violated their obligations or been ordered to die by their lord, was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. It was the option that preserved a samurai's honor and his family's position in the social hierarchy, as against the alternative of being executed as a commoner criminal. The famous case of the 47 Ronin, the group of samurai, who, in 1701, avenged their lord's forced seppuku by assassinating the officials responsible, then surrendered to the shogunate and were themselves ordered to perform seppuku, became one of the defining stories of the Edo period because it presented with unusual clarity the specific tensions within the Tokugawa system between loyalty to one's immediate lord and submission to shogunal authority. The shogunate's eventual decision to order the Ronin's seppuku rather than executing them as criminals was itself a political judgment, an acknowledgement that the popular perception of the Ronin as honorable men in an impossible situation made their execution too costly in terms of public sentiment. The daily life of ordinary people in Tokugawa, Japan, was organized by the specific four-tier social hierarchy: samurai, farmer, artisan, merchant, with untouchables, Ita, below all four, that the shogunate had inherited from earlier Japanese social organization and formalized into a legally defined system of distinct statuses. The hierarchy determined not just social prestige, but legal rights, economic obligations, and the physical markers of identity, the clothing, the hairstyle, the weapons, that a person was permitted to display. The experience of this hierarchy varied enormously depending on where you sat within it. A high-ranking samurai in Edo, attending the shogunate's administrative apparatus, living on a stipend from the domain treasury, conducting himself according to the elaborate protocols of warrior-class behavior, inhabited a world of genuine material comfort and social prestige, but also of significant constraint. He was obligated to live within his stipend, maintain the appearance appropriate to his rank, and conduct himself in ways that preserved the dignity of his class. The chronic financial difficulty of middle and lower samurai, whose rice stipends, fixed in the early Edo period, had not kept pace with the economic growth and price inflation of the 18th century, was one of the persistent social problems of the later period, producing a class of educated, proud, economically marginal men whose growing resentment was a source of political instability. The farming class, approximately 80% of the population, organized in village communities that were the fundamental administrative unit of lived lives whose quality depended primarily on the productivity of their land and the level of taxation imposed by their domain lord. The village community, Mura, was collectively responsible for its tax obligations, which created strong incentives for mutual surveillance and social pressure within the community to ensure that every household fulfilled its obligations. The headman, shoya or nanushi, who managed the village's interface with the domain administration, was a figure of real local authority, managing disputes, organizing communal labor on shared infrastructure, and representing the village to the officials above him. The urban commoner population of the great cities, the chonin, a category that included both merchants and artisans, inhabited the most economically dynamic and culturally productive environments in Tokugawa, Japan. Edo by the 18th century was a city of approximately 1 million people, roughly half samurai and half commoners, and the commoner half had developed a distinctive urban culture, centered on the kabuki theater, the woodblock print, the pleasure districts, the popular fiction and poetry that circulated through the lending library networks. That was simultaneously officially disdained by the samurai class and practically irresistible to its members. The townspeople's culture was the culture of a confident, prosperous, highly literate urban population that had figured out how to live well within the constraints of the Tokugawa social order, the specific economic organization of castle towns, the jokomachi that grew up around the daimyos. Fortified residence in each domain produced one of the most interesting urban sociologies in pre-modern world history. The castle town was organized by social function. The samurai residential districts closest to the castle, organized by rank. The merchant and artisan districts further out, organized by craft specialty. The religious establishments, Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines at the periphery. This spatial organization encoded the social hierarchy in the city's physical layout, making the relative status of each group visible in where they lived. And yet the economic reality undermined the social pretension. The merchant districts generated the wealth, the samurai districts consumed it, and the spatial hierarchy that placed merchants at the city's edge concealed a functional reality in which the merchants were the essential economic foundation of the whole system. Edo, in the first half of the 18th century, was, by population, one of the 3 or 4 largest cities on Earth, comparable to Beijing, roughly equivalent to London, and larger than Paris, Constantinople, or any other city in the Western Hemisphere. This was not an accident of geography or agriculture, but the product of deliberate political construction. The shogunate's capital had been built from a minor castle town to a metropolis of 1 million people within approximately a century, driven by the concentration of political and administrative functions there by the Sankin-Kotai requirement that brought tens of thousands of domain officials and their retinues to the city in alternating years, and by the commercial activity that serving this concentrated population generated. The spatial organization of Edo reflected the social hierarchy of the system that had built it. The Great Castle, the largest fortified complex in Japan, surrounded by a series of concentric moats and walls, occupied the high ground at the center of the city. Around it, in the elevated areas, Yamanote, the high city, lived the samurai, in neighborhoods organized by domain affiliation, the size and location of the residential compound reflecting the status of the lord it housed. The low ground, Shitamachi, the low city, close to the bay and the river deltas, was the merchant and artisan quarter, densely packed, commercially active, vulnerable to the fires that periodically swept through the wooden construction of the townspeople's districts. The castle itself was the political and symbolic center of the Tokugawa world. Edo Castle, whose donjon tower was destroyed by fire in 1657 and never rebuilt, a decision that reflected the shogunate's confidence that it would never need to withstand a siege, was surrounded by the largest garden complex in Japan and the administrative buildings of the shogunal government. The outer grounds, extending for kilometers in all directions, contained the residences of the senior Tokugawa advisors and officials, the daimyo compounds of the greatest domain lords, and the various specialized facilities, armories, rice warehouses, stables, needed to support the governing apparatus. The entire complex was a physical embodiment of the political system, its hierarchical spatial organization, mapping exactly the political distances between the center and the periphery. The road network that connected Edo to the rest of Japan was one of the remarkable infrastructural achievements of the Tokugawa period. The five great roads, Gakaido, the Tokaido, the Nakasendo, the Nikko Kaido, the Oshu Kaido, and the Koshu Kaido, radiated from Edo to the major regional centers and maintained posts at regular intervals where travelers could find accommodation, food, and, for official travelers, fresh horses. The roads were maintained by the villages along their routes as part of their labor, obligations to the shogunate, and their condition was generally good enough to support the movement of the great processions, sometimes thousands of people that accompanied daimyo on their alternate year journeys to and from Edo. The specific archaeological evidence from Edo castle excavations, conducted when construction projects in the modern Tokyo Government Center exposed Edo period remains, has produced a picture of the shogunal court's material life that contrasts sharply with the official ideology of samurai, austerity. The food waste from the castle's kitchen areas included luxury items from across Japan, specialized seafood from distant coastal regions, exotic vegetables from southern climates, expensive imported goods. The official ideology of the samurai, frugality, simplicity, the rejection of merchant luxuries, was not reflected in the actual diet of the people enforcing that ideology. A samurai who publicly endorsed frugality and privately ate expensive delicacies was not a hypocrite in the simple sense. He was a person navigating the specific contradiction between official ideology and lived reality that the Tokugawa system had made structurally unavoidable. The religious landscape of Tokugawa Japan was managed by the shogunate with the same systematic attention to political risk that characterized its management of every other potential source of social instability. The two major religious traditions, Shinto, the indigenous Japanese tradition organized around the veneration of kami, spirits or divine presences associated with natural phenomena, ancestors, and specific places, and Buddhism, introduced from China and Korea centuries earlier and thoroughly integrated into Japanese religious practice, were both incorporated into the administrative system in ways that made them simultaneously religious institutions and instruments of social control. The temple registration system, Tero-Sido, required every household in Japan to be registered with a Buddhist temple, whose priest was responsible for certifying that the household's members were not Christians and for maintaining records of births, deaths, and marriages that served the domain administration's census functions. This system gave the Buddhist temple network an administrative role that made it simultaneously a religious institution, a government record-keeping office, and a surveillance mechanism for detecting the Christian practice that the shogunate had determined was incompatible with political order. The combination of religious function and administrative responsibilities gave the temple network both social importance and institutional entrenchment. It could not easily be reformed or displaced without disrupting the administrative infrastructure that depended on it. The suppression of Christianity, beginning under Oda Nobunaga's successors and implemented with increasing thoroughness by the Tokugawa, was the most dramatic religious policy of the Edo period, driven by a combination of genuine theological concern about the exclusive claims of Christianity and well-founded political anxiety about the potential for Christian missionaries and their converts to serve as agents of European colonial powers. The Portuguese and Spanish missionaries, who had been active in Japan since the mid-16th century, had made hundreds of thousands of converts, particularly in Kyushu, and the European powers behind the missionary effort had demonstrated in other parts of Asia that religious conversion and commercial penetration could precede and political conquest. The Tokugawa's response was to prohibit Christianity entirely, to execute missionaries and persistent converts, and to implement the Fumi, picture-trampling system of annual religious compliance testing in which suspected Christians were required to trample on images of Christ or the Virgin Mary to demonstrate that they were not practitioners. The Shinto tradition, the indigenous religious practice centered on the veneration of kami at shrines that were distributed across the landscape in numbers reaching into the hundreds of thousands, was managed more gently, partly because it presented no comparable threat of foreign entanglement. The great shrines, Ise, dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu from whom the imperial family claimed descent, and Izumo, associated with the kami of the underworld and marriage, were pilgrimage destinations that drew millions of visitors and served as expressions of Japanese religious and cultural identity that the shogunate could incorporate, rather than suppress. The Buddhist establishments that the Tokugawa used as a tool of social control, the Turok system under which every Japanese family was required to be registered with a local Buddhist temple, created a bureaucratic relationship between religious institutions and the state that transformed Japanese Buddhism in the Edo period. Temples became record-keeping agencies, required to maintain detailed registers of births, deaths, marriages, and household compositions that the state used for taxation and social monitoring. The specific transformation this caused in Japanese Buddhist practice, from a tradition focused on spiritual cultivations and doctrinal study to a tradition equally focused on ritual services for the dead and administrative functions for the state, is one of the most significant institutional effects of the Tokugawa system. Buddhism became, in the Edo period, the bureaucratic infrastructure of household registration. Its subsequent reputation in Japan for excessive formalism and excessive focus on funeral ritual reflects this specific institutional history. The deliberate technological isolation that the Sakoku policy imposed on Japan, preventing Japanese from accessing the scientific and technological developments of the outside world and preventing the outside world from accessing Japanese technical knowledge, was both a source of remarkable indigenous development and an ultimately fatal constraint. The Japanese craftspeople and engineers of the Edo period, working without access to European scientific developments, produced achievements in certain fields that remain impressive by any standard, while falling increasingly in the military and industrial technologies that would determine the power relationships of the modern world. The swordsmiths of Japan had, by the Edo period, developed a metalworking tradition whose products, the katana and its associated blade types, represent one of the greatest achievements in the history of metallurgy. The specific process of folding high-carbon steel onto low-carbon steel, developed over centuries of accumulated craft knowledge, produced blades that combined hardness and flexibility in proportions that no other tradition had matched. The cutting-edge, harder, more brittle steel was capable of maintaining a sharpness achievable only through this specific manufacturing process. The spine, softer, more flexible steel, prevented the blade from shattering under lateral stress. Modern materials sciences analysis of surviving Edo period blades has confirmed what centuries of practical use had demonstrated. These were, by any metallurgical standard, extraordinary objects, combining aesthetic beauty with functional excellence in a way that reflects the specific character of a craft tradition that had been refining the same object for centuries. Dutch studies that developed in the small community of Japanese scholars permitted contact with the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, was the Tokugawa period's primary channel for the controlled import of Western knowledge. Dutch scholars, scientists, and books were the medium through which Japanese intellectuals accessed European astronomy, medicine, botany, and eventually physics and chemistry during the Edo period. The results were remarkable given the constraints. Japanese scholars translated Dutch medical texts, conducted anatomical dissections that challenged the traditional Chinese medical understanding of the body's structure, developed understanding of Newtonian mechanics, and engaged with Europeans' astronomy in ways that began to reveal how far the Western scientific tradition had advanced beyond what was available in the Chinese and Japanese traditions. The knowledge they were accessing, however, was always lagging behind the current state of European science. Filtered through Dutch intermediaries, delayed by the constraints of the limited contact permitted, and disconnected from the institutional infrastructure of European scientific culture that made the continuous development of that knowledge possible. The earthquake-resistant construction techniques developed in Japanese carpentry during the Edo period represent a form of structural engineering knowledge whose sophistication was not fully appreciated until the 20th century began applying modern structural analysis to the problem of seismic resistance. The specific joinery techniques of Japanese temple and castle construction, using interlocking timber connections that allowed structures to flex rather than resist seismic forces, absorbing energy through controlled movement rather than attempting to prevent movement, embody a practical understanding of structural dynamics that was arrived at through centuries of empirical observation and testing in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The Tokugawa system had been designed with considerable sophistication to address the internal threats to stability. The daimyo, whose military power might challenge the center, the religious organizations whose networks might organize resistance, the merchants, whose economic power was growing beyond what the ideological framework acknowledged. What it had not been designed to address was a qualitatively different kind of threat, a technological gap so large that the political and military institutions that maintained order internally were simply irrelevant to the external challenge. The Western powers that were expanding into Asia during the 18th and early 19th centuries had access to military technologies that had no equivalent in the Japanese tradition. Steam-powered warships that could operate regardless of wind direction, naval artillery that could reduce coastal fortifications from ranges that precluded any response with traditional weapons. Add to basket, country manufacturing capacity that could produce military equipment at scales and speeds that artisanal production could not approach. The specific encounter that crystallized this technological disparity for Japanese observers came not from direct contact with Western forces. The Sakoku policy had largely prevented that, but from intelligence gathered through the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, through the accounts of Japanese fishermen rescued by foreign ships, and from the observation of the increasingly frequent foreign vessels that appeared in Japanese waters during the early 19th century. The shogunate's response to the accumulating evidence of Western technological superiority was a combination of denial, selective adaptation, and political paralysis. Some domain lords, particularly in the Western domains of Satsuma and Choshu, which had long histories of external contact and which controlled the entry points most exposed to Western naval pressure, began clandestine programs of Western-style military modernization, purchasing or manufacturing rifles and artillery, employing foreign military advisors, and training their forces in Western drill. These programs were technically in violation of Tokugawa regulations that restricted domains from certain kinds of military activity, but the shogunate's declining capacity to enforce compliance made the violations politically manageable. The internal political opposition that these dynamics were generating was concentrated precisely in the domains Satsuma in Kyushu, Choshu in western Honshu, that were geographically furthest from Edo and historically most resentful of Tokugawa dominance. The specific political vocabulary that organized this opposition combined the language of loyalty to the emperor, whose theoretical supremacy over the shogunate had been formally acknowledged but practically irrelevant for 2.5 centuries, with the language of national crisis. The country was in danger, the shogunate was failing to protect it, and the restoration of direct imperial rule was the only adequate response. This argument, sono joy, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, proved politically compelling in ways that the shogunate could not effectively counter. The specific character of the domain rivalries that eventually broke the Tokugawa system is worth understanding in detail, because it illustrates how the shogunate's own success created the conditions of its failure. The Tazama domains, the outside lords whose ancestors had been on the losing side at Sekigahara in 1600, had been deliberately weakened by the shogunate over 2.5 centuries, kept poor through Sankin Kotai expenses, kept geographically isolated from each other, kept militarily subordinate through a system of surveillance and administrative oversight. And yet they had been kept intact as domains, with their own administrations, their own samurai classes, and their own accumulations of domain-specific institutional knowledge and loyalty. When the crisis of the 1850s and 1860s created the opportunity, the domains that had been weakened most aggressively, Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, Hizen, had the most to gain from the shogunate's overthrow and the institutional capacity to do something about it. The Tokugawa system at its height. Roughly the century between 1615, when the last significant military challenge to shogunal authority was eliminated with the fall of Osaka Castle, and 1720, when the population growth that had driven economic expansion began to slow, was, by any comparative standard, a remarkable political achievement. The specific problem it solved, maintaining political stability across a country that had experienced a century of continuous civil war, was real and important, and it solved it for 2.5 centuries, a duration that no other Japanese political system before or since has approached. The internal peace of the Pax Tokugawa was not merely the absence of warfare, though that alone would have been significant. It was the creation of conditions in which economic development, cultural production, and population growth could proceed for generations without the destruction that warfare had imposed in the Sengoku period. The rice production increases that fed a population growing from 12 to 30 million. The commercial economy that made the merchant houses of Osaka and Edo wealthy enough to rival daimyo. The urban culture that produced kabuki theatre and the ukiyo-e woodblock prints that would eventually transform European painting. All of this was possible because the Tokugawa system had made the basic conditions of civil society, security, predictability, rule of law, available in a way that the Sengoku period had destroyed. The high Edo culture, the culture of the prosperous townspeople of the great cities in the 17th and 18th centuries, was one of the most sophisticated urban popular cultures in the world. The woodblock print tradition that produced Hokusai's Great Wave and Hiroshi's 53 Stations of the Tokaido, works that remain among the most globally recognized art objects ever produced, was a commercial popular art form produced in editions of hundreds or thousands of copies, sold at prices that ordinary townspeople could afford, depicting subjects of immediate relevance to the lives of its consumers. The kabuki theatre, the haiku poetry tradition associated with Matsuo Basho, the prose fiction of Ihara Saikaku, the martial fiction of Takizawa Bakin. The cultural productivity of the Edo period was extraordinary by any standard and was accomplished by a society that was officially closed to the rest of the world. The specific fiscal mechanism that was destroying the samurai class from within was the rice stipend system. Samurai were paid in rice, a fixed annual allocation measured in koku, one koku being roughly enough rice to feed one person for a year. The problem was that the price of rice fluctuated with harvests, while commercial goods, the city products that samurai increasingly wanted, were priced in money. When rice was cheap, a samurai's fixed stipend bought less than it had the year before. The merchants who bought rice cheap and sold manufactured goods at stable money, prices accumulated capital steadily, while the samurai, who needed money to buy goods, sold their rice stipends at whatever price the market offered. A class system based on military honor was being economically hollowed out by the same market forces that the system officially despised. The specific contradiction that made the samurai class's economic position untenable was the gap between legal status and economic function. Samurai were legally prohibited from engaging in commerce. Buying and selling for profit was beneath their dignity and explicitly restricted by sumptuary regulations that governed what they could wear, eat, and consume. But their fixed rice stipends made them permanently dependent on the merchants they officially despised. They needed to sell their rice for cash to buy anything in the increasingly monetized economy, and they needed to borrow from merchants at interest rates that reflected the merchants' understanding of the samurai's helplessness. When their income fell short of their expenses, the structural impossibility of their position produced the specific social phenomenon that Edo period literature documents obsessively: the samurai who was officially superior and practically dependent, maintaining the performance of dignity, while quietly managing a financial situation that would have been recognized as insolvency in any commercial culture that used the word. The administrative deterioration of the later Tokugawa Shogunate was a slow-motion crisis rather than a sudden collapse, but its specific mechanisms are clearly visible in the historical record. The fiscal system that had funded the shogunate's operations was organized around rice revenues that were fixed at the levels of the early 17th century, while the money economy that had developed over 2 centuries of commercial growth had created inflation that steadily eroded the real value of rice-denominated incomes. Samurai stipends, paid in rice, fixed in quantity, bought progressively less over time. The shogunate's own revenues, similarly denominated in rice, failed to keep pace with the costs of governing an increasingly complex commercial economy. The result was a chronic fiscal crisis that successive shogunates attempted to address through currency debasement, forced loans from merchants, and austerity programs, with results ranging from temporary stabilization to accelerated deterioration. The specific political crisis that accelerated the shogunate's collapse was the arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet in July 1853. The 4 ships, 2 steam-powered, 2 sailing vessels, all heavily armed, anchored in Uraga Bay south of Edo and made visible in a single afternoon the specific technological gap that the shogunate had been refusing to fully acknowledge. The steam-powered warships were not merely more powerful than anything in the Japanese fleet. They were a different category of technology entirely, requiring industrial manufacturing infrastructure to produce and maintain that Japan did not possess. Japanese officials who rowed out to inspect the ships wrote accounts describing them with the specific vocabulary of the incomprehensible: large as mountains, moving without wind, making a sound like thunder. The shogunate accepted Perry's letter, asked for a year to consider it, and spent that year in a political crisis. that exposed how completely the system had lost the capacity for active collective decision-making. The Convention of Kanagawa, signed in March 1854, opened 2 Japanese ports to American ships, a limited concession that satisfied Perry's immediate demands, but that set a precedent whose implications the anti-foreign faction within Japan could not accept. Further treaties with America, Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands followed, collectively opening Japanese ports to foreign trade and establishing extraterritorial legal rights for foreigners in Japan. Each treaty was experienced by the opponents of the shogunate as a demonstration of weakness, and each demonstration of weakness strengthened the political argument that the shogunate had forfeited the legitimacy to govern. The specific intellectual crisis that preceded the Meiji Restoration, the debate within Japanese intellectual culture about how to respond to the Western threat, generated one of the most sophisticated bodies of political philosophy produced anywhere in the 19th century, the various schools of thought. The nativists, who argued that Japan's spiritual and cultural traditions were superior to anything the West had, produced, and needed only to be purified of foreign contamination. The pragmatists, who argued that Western technology could be adopted without adopting Western values or political forms. The reformers, who argued that the political and institutional changes required to achieve Western-style military power could not be made without also changing the social structure. The reformers were right. The Meiji Restoration adopted all 3 positions simultaneously and produced something genuinely new. A modernizing state that was also an emperor cult, a technological society with Confucian social values, a constitutional monarchy with no meaningful constraints on imperial authority. The Boshin War. The civil conflict that ended the Tokugawa Shogunate lasted from January 1868 to May 1869, approximately 17 months, and was less a conventional military campaign than a rapid political disintegration. The forces arrayed against the shogunate were led by the domains of Satsuma and Choshu, which had spent the previous decade modernizing their military forces with Western pattern rifles and artillery, and which had concluded an alliance in 1866 that combined their respective military and political resources against their common target. When the conflict began, the coalition moved quickly against Edo and the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, who had taken the position in 1867, chose to surrender rather than subject the city to a destructive siege. The specific event that historians mark as the formal end of the Tokugawa Shogunate is the Meiji Restoration of January 3rd, 1868. The announcement, in the name of the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji, that direct imperial rule was being restored after more than 2.5 centuries of shogunal government. The announcement was a political construction. The young emperor's name was used to legitimize the authority of the Satsuma Choshu coalition, not a reflection of the emperor's own political activity, but its consequences were real and permanent. The Tokugawa political system, which had organized Japan since 1603, was dissolved. The social consequences of the Meiji Restoration for the samurai class were, in historical perspective, revolutionary. The domain system was abolished in 1871, Soiskit, eliminating the administrative structures through which samurai had exercised their governmental functions. The samurai right to carry swords in public was abolished in 1876. The samurai stipends were commuted to bonds in 1876, eliminating the rice income basis of the class's economic existence. The former samurai class, approximately 5 to 6% of the Japanese population, found itself in the span of a decade stripped of its legal privileges, its economic support, and its social function, and required to redefine its identity within a new political and social order that had no place for warriors at the top of the hierarchy. The last significant military resistance came from the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, the final large-scale uprising of the samurai class against the Meiji government led by Saigo Takamori, one of the architects of the Restoration, who had subsequently broken with the government over the pace and character of its modernization program. Saigo's rebellion fought with a combination of traditional samurai weapons and modern firearms, was defeated by the conscript army that the Meiji government had built on Western military models. The defeat demonstrated, definitively, that the age of the samurai was over. Saigo performed seppuku rather than surrender, and was subsequently lionized as a tragic hero, whose commitment to traditional values had been more important to him than survival. The monument to him at Ueno Park in Tokyo, erected decades after his death, is still one of the most visited public sculptures in Japan. The speed of the Meiji transformation, the radical reorganization of Japanese society and government accomplished in the 2 decades following the 1868 restoration, was made possible by the specific institutional inheritance of the Tokugawa period. The Tokugawa system had created, that over 250 years, a population with high literacy rates, a sophisticated commercial economy, a dense network of urban centers connected by reliable roads and communication systems, and a bureaucratic class, the samurai, whose members were educated, literate, and accustomed to administrative work. The Meiji government was not building a modern state from nothing. It was redirecting a highly organized, pre-modern state toward new objectives, using the human capital that the Tokugawa system had developed. The specific speed of Japanese modernization, which astonished Western observers, was the product of Tokugawa institutional investment, not of some inherent cultural affinity for rapid change. The archaeological and historical investigation of the Tokugawa period has accelerated significantly since the post-war development of Japanese archaeology as a systematic academic discipline. The excavation of Edo castles' surviving grounds and the areas of modern Tokyo that overlie the former samurai and townspeople's quarters has produced physical evidence of the material culture of the period that sublimates and complicates the picture available from the documentary record. Ceramic assemblages from the townspeople's districts show the range and quality of goods available in the Edo commercial market. Faunal remains from samurai residential sites reveal dietary patterns that the official ideology of frugality does not acknowledge. Deer, wild boar, sea turtle, and other luxury foods appear in the archaeological record of high-status samurai households whose documentary traces show no acknowledgement of their consumption. The body of documentary evidence from the Tokugawa period is enormous. The Shogunate administrative system generated and preserved records at a scale that has no predecessor in Japanese history, and the domain archives, temple records, merchant account books, and private diaries of the period constitute one of the richest pre-modern documentary records of any non-Western society. The challenge for historians is not the absence of evidence, but its abundance. The sheer volume of surviving material from 2.5 centuries of highly literate, administratively thorough governance makes comprehensive synthesis impossible and specialized study essential. The specific question of what the shogunate knew, and when it knew it about Western technological development, reconstructed from the intelligence, reports that the Nagasaki Dutch Post transmitted, the Rangaku scholars' translations of Western texts, and the accounts of Japanese castaways who had been rescued by foreign ships and debriefed on their return, reveals a political system that had more accurate information about the external threat than its eventual response suggested. The shogunate knew, by the 1840s, that Western military technology was qualitatively different from anything available in Japan. The problem was not lack of information. It was the political impossibility of acting on the information, of implementing the kind of military modernization that the threat required, without disrupting the social and political arrangements that the shogunate's legitimacy depended on. The cultural legacy of the Tokugawa period in modern Japan is enormous and largely unacknowledged as such. The Japanese aesthetic sensibilities that have become globally influential in the 20th and 21st centuries. The attention to craft and material quality, the specific relationship between simplicity and refinement, the particular forms of seasonal awareness that organize Japanese cuisine and garden design are products of the Edo period's cultural development. The tea ceremony, ikebana, the woodblock print tradition, the garden aesthetic, the ceramic traditions. All of these reached their characteristic forms during the Edo period and carry its specific cultural values into the present. The global popularity of Japanese design, food, and cultural products in the contemporary world is, in significant part, a legacy of 2.5 centuries of intensive cultivation of aesthetic sensibility within a society that had the stability and the resources to invest in cultural refinement across multiple generations. The transformation that the Meiji Restoration produced, from feudal isolation to industrial modernity in less than a generation, was so rapid and so complete that it remains one of the most remarkable episodes of deliberate national transformation in the modern world. Japan went from wooden castle walls to ironclad warships in 30 years. From rice-stipend samurai to conscript armies, from closed country to imperial power. The specific qualities that made this transformation possible: the high literacy rates of the Edo period, the administrative competence of the samurai class, the commercial sophistication of the merchant culture, the specific forms of collective discipline that the Tokugawa system had developed over 2.5 centuries, were all products of the system that the transformation destroyed. The Tokugawa Shogunate made modern Japan possible and was then dismantled to allow modern Japan to exist. That paradox is still present in the specific character of Japanese modernity, which remains, in ways that Japanese cultural observers have been analyzing for a century, the most distinctive synthesis of tradition and transformation in the modern world.